Hey everybody, and welcome back to the fourth episode of Snapshots in Time. And as you can probably tell, this episode is going to be focusing on Counter-Strike Global Offensive. The kind of concept of the show is to celebrate and kind of put context to the first year of Overwatch as a game. And to do so, I'm just talking to various guests about other games that they've been involved in, just to kind of get some context. And trying to kind of answer the question, how is Overwatch doing for being 1 year old into the official release of the game? Some people have kind of, as you guys have seen, have given me different answers, so we'll kind of see where we go. My guest today, obviously, is Thorin. He is the self-proclaimed esports historian, talk show host, Summoning Insight, Oversight, Counterpoints, Talk to Thorin, Thorin's Thoughts. You just started the Thorin Query. And then
Shows.
yeah, a lot of shows. And then now you are also a writer for Esports. Previously Gamers, previously Gold Pretend, I think. Was that
Yeah,
the
if you go
progression?
back far enough, yeah.
Yeah, and then we can go back farther than that. So obviously today we're going to be talking about Counter-Strike Global Offensive. And the place that I actually wanted to start was this is a concept that hasn't really existed in a lot of the other titles. And it's something that you, I know, have been very vocal about in the past, which is frag movies in Counter-Strike. And kind of how the way that the creation of these of the content kind of helps shape some of the stories around players. And this is something that we're just starting to see in Overwatch. Do you have anything you want to talk about on frag movies?
Well, funnily enough, in Counter-Strike itself, like the game before
Yeah.
CS:GO, that was massively influential
Hmm.
actually as to which players were stars, because you have to realize back then there weren't actually streams for the
Yeah.
game. And when you would watch the game in old versions of Counter-Strike, you actually would go in through, essentially, you would be in the you
Yeah.
do what essentially the guy who's the observer for the stream does now. You're in the spectator client, and you pick the point of view you want to watch. Like there was an auto director, but it was
Yeah.
terrible back then because obviously they hadn't programmed it to know what to look for.
Hmm.
So famously, there weren't like clips that went up right after a game
Yeah.
where everyone sees the cool play or everyone knows who had the best game. In theory, every fan's directing the experience themselves. So as a result, they'll miss a lot of the action in a game. Not everyone went and downloaded the demo afterwards to watch it through again. In fact, if you find this now in esports, a lot of people, unless they watch it live, they never
Hmm.
get back to watching that game that they missed or the one that they only caught half of. So understandably, if you can put out a frag movie that was like good quality kills, or you had a big name and you put out a frag
Yeah.
movie, or it was done by a good movie maker, this could make a player who might actually have only been, let's say, just as an example, like the seventh best AWPer. Well, if the other six best AWPers never had a frag movie, never had these things, there'll be some fans to this day who think that guy was the best ever because,
Hmm.
understandably, they got the way it was even packaged was really
Yeah.
key. So I do think in different games, that's actually something that's changed over esports. Like in CS:GO, it can still exist. You can still have good frag
Yeah.
movies. They just, some of the aspects of the physics of how the game look, unfortunately, make it not as cool. And then the media age of the fact that, like, you see every little clip right after it happens. People
Yeah.
even now with Twitter can tweet the clip in a little video
Hmm.
on Twitter. So you have like unparalleled engagement in that respect. But I have to say, in other esports games, I think that actually has been something that didn't translate. Like I know, for example, in all the MOBA games, they've never really been able to do that as much. Part of it actually is the fact that obviously in some of those games, like League of Legends is the worst example, you don't have replays until recently.
Yeah.
So you could never actually make certain frag movies from that person's like not perspective, but
Hmm.
focusing on them.
Yeah.
And also I think just naturally in those games, they're a lot messier. Like one thing that people started doing, sadly it never caught on widespread, was when you make a MOBA game,
Hmm.
there's a little trick. Anyone who's watching this now, at the beginning of the clip, what you do is you put like a box or a marker or a circle or an arrow and you point at who the person is you're supposed to be watching. Because when the screen comes on, there's 10 characters, isn't there? So how am
Yeah.
I supposed to know who I'm looking at? So these are just small nuance things that obviously, as
Yeah.
an aficionado and an elitist, I know
A
it's
little bit. So actually, but I'm happy that you mentioned how kind of messy some other games are, because that was something that in the recent, I think it came out maybe 2 days ago, you did a Reflections with Alchemist. And if you guys didn't watch that one was a really good one about spectating in Counter-Strike, and hopefully Alchemist can help out with Overwatch. Um, and we're looking into, there was a pretty big discussion on how to specifically spectate the game and get the story through, like the proper story and how you set up the shots and everything. And this is something that, of course, in Overwatch hasn't necessarily always been done super well because the game is so chaotic, because everybody has different abilities. There's particle flecks just flying everywhere all over the screen. So is this something that we can maybe learn from Counter-Strike, specifically like the way that they set up stories with like the grenades and stuff, like the abilities, not really?
Well, one thing that a lot of people don't realize about Counter-Strike, and what was essentially kind of the underlying theme of that interview that I did with
Hmm.
Alchemist, is that he was actually doing a lot of stuff that they don't even do now to some degree in Counter-Strike. They only
Hmm.
just started to build more up to doing that with like E-League type productions, which
Yeah.
obviously he's involved in. So he was doing stuff back in like 2006, 2007 that was revolutionary for the time.
Hmm.
And then because his production studio died out, because the site he was working for died out, etc.,
Yeah.
etc. Unfortunately, we essentially went back to the Stone Age in terms of technology, and we
Hmm.
never got back there until very, very recently. So the key element is a lot of people, even fans today, don't understand that when you show Counter Strike, you are not trying to show all the kills.
Yeah.
Like, you will actually never show all the kills. In fact, if you think about it, in a 10-person game, you
Yeah.
can get, if you're really, really good, like for example, this is one of the reasons people still laud Steele to this day when he did the Guy by Power Player, when before he was banned, he used to do a lot of the observing for events he wasn't actually attending with his team.
Hmm.
Because one of the things he was really good at was just from being a pro, but also with in-game leaders' mind,
Yeah.
he was very good at knowing where the action would take place. And he was probably better than anyone at being like at that spot to be on the right POVs, you know? Even so, though, he couldn't always know which of the two players is going to get the kill
Of
or
course.
what would then lead to, you know? So you're never trying to get all the kills. That's a key concept to understand because this is obviously going to transfer to Overwatch, where
Oh yeah.
that's impossible anyway. There's
Yeah.
multiple
It's.
kills going on at all times.
Hmm.
But the point Alchemist was trying to get to was instead, what you want to do is tell the story of the round.
Hmm.
Now, within the round, yeah, the story could break apart differently. Like the story is like this team's attacking in this particular way, and then you might choose within that, for example, if the attack's very intricate, maybe you're
Hmm.
going to show the attacking force,
Yeah.
and if the defense is very clever and you can kind of tell it's an interesting counter, maybe you're going to show the defensive setup.
Hmm.
But the idea is those are going to be the broad strokes you're going to paint with, and then within that, yeah, you've got an expert observer who in general is trying to figure out, right, within that framework, which of these players that, you know, let's say in a 10-man Counter-Strike game, let's say there's really only 2 or 3 options on this
Hmm.
specific strategy of where they're going to hit.
Yeah.
Then he's trying to pick, yeah, who's most likely to get the kill, who shall I
Hmm.
show initially. But even then, it actually doesn't matter if he misses the kills, because if you have a proper setup and the level of production in esports now,
Hmm.
you have secondary observers
Yeah.
who catch things as a replay anyway.
Hmm.
So ideally, I mean, Counter-Strike obviously has an advantage here because we have the round break.
Yeah.
So you actually have a little bit of time where you can automatically show the replay, much like in the NFL, you know, when it's between the plays, it's easy to kind of bring something up. Admittedly, in Overwatch, that's tougher, but I feel like
Yeah.
there's solutions in all these games. Like, for example, in Overwatch,
Hmm.
obviously you're still going to get team wipes. You're going to
Yeah.
get the whole team dying and respawning. So even if you don't have to show it as like the whole screen, you can
Hmm.
have like a picture-in-picture effect there where people can roughly see that they're setting up again and then see what's going on. I feel like there's a lot of solutions, but the key, as I'm kind of outlining from that Alchemist interview, is you've got to
Hmm.
have a set philosophy. Like you've got to figure it out yourself. What am I trying to do here? What is the ideal within your own decision making? You know, what you're gonna have to qualitatively judge that yourself, obviously. And different people for sure could go different routes.
Hmm.
But at the moment, it feels like in general, without having spoken to the people who do the top level Overwatch
Hmm.
observing, like they are just more like the guy I described before in Counter Strike, who's thinking, right, my job's just catch all the kills, be in a cool spot, you know.
Hmm.
I mean, there's even a level to which I'd like people who do the observing in Overwatch to kind of not necessarily like agree, but know what the caster's philosophy for how to cast the game is.
Hmm.
Because then he could even be showing certain things, knowing the caster is going to talk about that, and then setting it up. Because that's another problem in all esports games, actually. Every caster duo that I'm aware of, maybe it's not the case in Overwatch, because I know, like for OGN, for example, I doubt they have any control over the feed. But in all the other games, like Counter-Strike, yeah, we have one PC, which is the program, you know, which is like showing what the stream's showing. And in
Yeah.
theory, you do cast over that, but they always have a second PC that they can control themselves. So the worst thing you ever can have, obviously, is if they talk about something awesome and nothing of that is shown on screen. So I feel like it's a very tricky topic, but I think obviously Overwatch is, for me, probably the game where it has to succeed the most and has to have the most solutions found, because the viewership of the game obviously right now doesn't translate to the player base and in theory the esports investment into it. So that probably is kind of the Gordian knot to decide if it becomes a huge game.
Yeah. So on the bright side, as the viewers might know, in the previous episode, actually, Doa did talk about that he and Monty are working with the casters because he and Monty prefer to have a lot more third-person shots. Well, observers, but also third-person shots, right? Kind of setting up the team fight so we can see, going into it where everyone's kind of positioned and stuff, so you can have a better idea of maybe even what to look for in that team fight. I remember Doa specifically was talking about, for as a play-by-play, of course, he likes to see, where everyone is, so we can kind of keep in his mind if a player's going here, they might run into each other and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, And I think this was another point that I believe it was also you or maybe someone else in Counter Strike made it, and it was the way that you have to watch clutch rounds actually in Counter Strike. Where apparently it took them a little while to realize that if it's like a 3v1 or a 2v1, you try to always spectate on the one. You don't spectate on the two
Oh,
or
it
the
took many
three.
years. I'm like over
Hmm.
a decade for people to figure this
Did it
out.
really
Because
take that long?
basically,
Wow.
the principle was
Hmm.
because if you think about it, it's actually logically very intelligent. The
Yeah.
problem is in a scenario where someone's in a 1vx situation, let's make it a really extreme one, like a
Hmm.
1v4.
Okay.
Unlikely you're going to win that round, especially if you're two top teams, you know?
Yeah.
Logically, you'd actually think, well, just show any of the players. In fact, if anything, show the team that have the 4, because they're going to kill this guy definitely, and then the round's over and they've won the round, right? So that would be like a very simplistic way of thinking it. But what people figured out was you always show the 1, because if he dies anyway, well, we all knew it was going to happen. It wasn't that great action to watch anyway. But if somehow, the 1 in 10 chance, 1 in 5, 1 in 25 chance that he actually kills all 4, and you miss that, sure, you could show a replay, but you're going to feel like you didn't really see what happened in the round. And there was a very famous example of this, unfortunately, that actually did happen with some bad observing, where someone didn't follow this at the major. We had one of the best rounds of all time, which is where Simple did his 1v2 no-scope clutch on Cash.
Yeah.
And basically, we got 0 kills from that in the actual observer feed because they did not follow the rule, and they were one of the 2 rather than the 1. So that's like a classic example just to show the reason why. Like, you don't essentially lose anything if he doesn't do anything, but if he does something, you would have lost everything if you didn't have it on in that moment. But this is just a simple example of how, again, that's not necessarily the best view always, but you're trying to find a hard and fast rule that will allow you to navigate a very chaotic environment and be able to tell the story. Because that's the key part, is like really hardcore players and analysts, etc. Yeah, they don't need to watch. You're not designing the game to be watched by them. They're going to analyze and watch it anyway. Like for example, when I'm saying in the old days before streams, I used to go in and be in the client moving around. Like, I'm not going to pretend I moved around in the way that an observer would or told the story. I used to stay on the best players and just watch them. Like if I could go into Overwatch now and I could control the cam, I would just stay on Flower 24/7 and I wouldn't care what anyone else in that game does and who dies. What do I care, right? I want to watch the best player. But that would be terrible to tell the story, and it wouldn't help, especially the casual players who you're trying to keep sticking around and build up. They would think this game is very boring, actually. You just see it from one perspective, and it's also about how well he did, and they don't understand the context to what happened. So to me, you're trying to connect the observing now to the casting if you can.
Yeah. So this was another topic that was brought up actually, where there's a lot of people who would be interested, of course, in spectating one player from that first-person view, and it's kind of difficult to strike this balance of the third-person shots and setting up the story like for all players involved, but also because that first-person view to the casual fan at home is the familiar view, right? They're not used to going into the client and spectating games themselves. They're used to playing the game and kind of seeing that view. So kind of making it familiar is a little bit uncomfortable sometimes to try and kind of work in. So one of the other big topics that has been a contentious problem in Overwatch lately has been the upcoming Overwatch League, of course, and the kind of lack of LAN events in the past several months. And was this something that happened early on in Counter-Strike where Valve kind of restricted like tournament licenses for Counter-Strike?
No, I mean, that's a good joke if you've ever followed a Valve game, because famously Valve doesn't do any of that
anything.
stuff.
Yeah.
Like I always say, my analogy for it is, like, I mean, it's funny. Back in the day, we thought Blizzard was like the really strict parent who doesn't let you do anything unless they want you to. It actually turns out, obviously, Riot was just waiting in the wings the whole time to take that throne by themselves. But I always say, what's good about Valve, what I like about them, is not that they're the good parent who lets you do everything. They are just the absolute parent. So you can get up to whatever you want, and that might be terrible, but it also means you can do whatever you want. So the good thing to me is, because they're out of the way, it's everyone else is free to do whatever they want. So I have to say, one of the good things about the early days of CSGO is it wasn't doing well as an esports game, and it looked like it would never have a chance to be the #1 esports game. It wasn't even going to be what 1.6 was.
Yeah.
It was doing so badly, but there were always LANs, and that's the good thing, because what happened is, since it was a totally free market, and there were some people who would watch, first of all, there was either the organizations who did do some Counter-Strike before, so they at least were familiar with the game and wanted to do tournaments, or you would just get these smaller tournaments where they could get just enough prize money together to get some teams from that region together, or the odd tournament where people could afford to fly over and have a semi-international type plan. So there always were those tournaments because there was at least enough interest that it could be filled in that way. That's obviously exactly, in my opinion, the problem of what Blizzard has done in Overwatch, is that it's not that they've said, right, well, we're just focused on Overwatch League, so we're not going to help you. They've actively said, you can't do tournaments now. In fact, we're just going to shut it down, because as much as everyone says the viewership isn't that great at the moment in Overwatch, I guarantee you, if Valve hadn't done that, and if they hadn't have strongly intimated like everything resets at the Overwatch League, for sure you would have had MLGs and
Yeah.
IEMs and DreamHacks. All these people would at least have done a few tournaments, and
Mhm.
it only takes like each of them doing one or two. You'd have had a fairly healthy LAN circuit, you know. It would have been at least as good, like I say, as the early days
Mhm.
of something like CS:GO. So in that sense, whether it works out or not with Overwatch, it just seems bizarre. Like I can't really think of a good reason as to why they'd do that, you know.
Yeah, I think the official, not the official, but kind of like the unofficial reason was like they want to kind of control the product leading up, so they want to make sure that only like the high quality, productions go out, something like that. It doesn't make much sense. But actually, for those tournaments, you said that organizers had done previous Counter Strike games, and that's obviously something that Overwatch doesn't have. It's Overwatch is not kind of in a series of games, right? And Counter Strike Global Offensive, of course, was after these games. And I know that there's a lot of players who kind of stuck to some of the older versions and didn't come over quite immediately. So that kind of hurt the tournament scene where there's some organizers who were still kind of stuck on previous games, or do they all move away or move on to Global Offensive?
Oh, the funny thing is, in the very, very early
Mm-hmm.
days, it was kind of split because what
Hmm.
happened was the top, I mean, notably the top three teams, but beyond them there were like a couple other teams. If they were at the top of 1.6, they just kept playing whatever lands were left. Like until the circuit
Okay.
announced, like, there's no more dream hacks. I mean, we already knew IEM had gone because they very
Mm-hmm.
famously came out quite early and
Yeah.
basically said like we're going to drop the game completely. But for stuff like DreamHack, those tournaments still existed, and so understandably, if you were top three, there's no point venturing into a new game that has as much or less money
Yeah.
when you could, in theory, win these last tournaments. So they kind of played it out. And so for people like DreamHack, they kind of like simultaneously had tournaments going on. They had some CSGO ones early, and then they finished up their 1.6 ones. And then the key thing is, the people, this is why it wasn't going to succeed as a game
Mm-hmm.
initially, is that yes, the people who ran the early CSGO tournaments for the first year were all people with history in CSGO, in 1.6 obviously rather.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that most of them weren't the top tier brands. So for
Mm-hmm.
example, ESL ran tournaments, but
Mm-hmm.
they actually purposely used to run it in something called EMS. Now EMS now transitioned to become called ESL1, and it's
Yeah.
its own brand, and it is a premier tournament brand.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, EMS major series used to be below Intel Extreme Masters. It used to be basically where like teams that were like semi-pro or games that weren't top tier were played out. Now, there's a secondary reason as to why they put CSGO in here, aside from the fact the game wasn't big, because they also had Dota 2 there,
Yeah.
and Dota 2 was already a pretty big game. So actually, one of the reasons why, as we found out later, I actually did an interview with Carmack about this,
Mm-hmm.
was that Riot themselves essentially implied that they didn't want, their game sharing the same brand as the Valve games. So that's
Mm-hmm.
like a secondary issue, but I have to say, for CSGO, I don't think that alone covers it, because it's
Mm-hmm.
pretty clear to me that people like ESL also themselves considered CSGO now a second tier game within their company. They
Mm-hmm.
didn't consider it up with the League of Legends and StarCraft 2s of the world. They thought of it as like, yeah, well, we'll do these small tournaments. And famously, the EMS tournaments were all held actually out of the ESL studio, which is just a tiny little
Yeah.
studio that was in their offices. It was never a big stadium event. So, okay, ESL had it, but you can see that it was a step down even in that company. DreamHack had it as a game, but then in theory, the only reason it would be number one for them is because they didn't do a lot of the other big games. Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, StarCraft 2 was still pretty big. League of Legends, obviously, already, they got that sliced away because LCS came along.
Yeah.
So, in general, the problem was the lands were either small independent ones or they were big name people, but they
Mm-hmm.
weren't themselves giving it the big focus.
Mm-hmm.
So, even within those companies, you could get a sense that they didn't see it being number one.
But it still obviously kind of helped fuel the game until it did obviously get to where it is now.
Well, there was regular tournaments. That's the point. Like
Yeah.
every month would be a tournament of note in some way. Like maybe not every team was there, but it's like the key to me to a tournament
Mhm.
circuit is you don't have to have the 10 big lands in a year that every team attends. You just have to have it where, like, let's say you took one team out of all the big teams, they just have to go to like 6 of the 10 lands, and then another team could go to a different 5 as long as there's a bit of overlap,
Yeah.
and it still weaves some sort of a story
Yeah.
between all the tournaments and has a healthy scene in that sense.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we don't have that in Overwatch right now, where the Korean scene has developed kind of in isolation, and just a few Western teams have even got to come over and really play and practice in that kind of environment. So that was actually something you mentioned, though. You mentioned that Riot kind of sliced away the market share of League of Legends from everybody, and that was something that Counter Strike, not so much now because there's other games that have open circuits. But I remember a few years ago that was a big discussion where the LCS, and Riot consumes all of League of Legends, but Counter-Strike, that open circuit was like such a big deal for them, and they were able to have kind of that free market competition between tournament organizers. So early on, was those EMS events, were they the largest events, like the most prestigious for Counter-Strike Global Offensive?
Yeah, in theory, they probably were the
Okay.
biggest because at the time you had a bunch of tournaments where it was
Hmm.
their big version of a CS event. So, for example,
Mm.
ESEA used to have their LAN that would be in North America, and that was the end of their online season.
Okay.
So that was a pretty big one as well. But obviously, the problem there is not every European team could go over. So,
Mm.
just in terms of the actual stacked nature of the field, it didn't feel as prestigious.
Mm.
So, in general, the EMS1 events were the biggest, even though actually, funnily enough, they didn't have any NA quality at that point in time because obviously the two brands were split. It was later on that they became ESL Pro League.
Hmm.
But at the time, Europe was the best in the game, so it didn't matter. You just had to have, as long as you had 7 or 8 of the top teams there, and it had close to the highest prize money.
Okay.
These factors all combined, and it was still ESL, so you still had like ESL casters,
Yeah.
and you had Red Eye, etc., and you had the production aspect. So those were at the time the biggest game because this is an aspect that I actually think this is another area that Blizzard really dropped the ball in Overwatch, which is even if they're going to do their own Overwatch League, and they claim within that it's been constantly implied that like they'll allow some open circuit for the rest of the year. Even if that's the case, one thing that actually was really cool before the LCS era in League of Legends was that they had the open circuit. And so you did see there were tournaments that like the top Korean team, the champion of OGN, went over to the West and played in an MLG against the NA teams.
Yep.
So I think that's why I don't buy the angle of like it was about like the quality of the product and it was about like keeping the storyline straight because actually you killed a load of storylines. Like if the envious team who'd won OGN had come back over to NA and played in an NA tournament like right afterwards and gotten upset, that would be an incredible storyline.
Yeah.
Well, that makes even the next OGN season better. Likewise, if any of the like this is one of the problems you have in the Korean scene. So a team like Meta Athena could have won the last split season of Apex. Like they were
Quite
doing very
possibly.
well at one point in time. But for all we know, maybe they would have gone to the West and gone to a tournament and been in international waters and never had, not very experienced players and maybe flopped. You never know. These things happen. I mean, I remember when one of the best teams in League of Legends, MVP Ozone, got bought by Samsung and they went to Worlds and didn't get out the group. And at the time, Korean teams were expected to all, go top 4, top. So you never actually got to see a lot of the things that to me are basic qualities of a global esport. So what's bizarre is before they've region locked it, they almost in a way region locked it by not allowing anyone to do any tournaments.
Yeah, and that actually is a good point. That there's a lot of Korean teams that there's a pretty solid chance they would flop at international events outside of Korea because so many of the Korean players in Overwatch right now are incredibly young. I mean, like Flowers, like 16 or something. There's a ton of like 15-year-old players. There's a chance they just like get nervous in a new country. Um, so, but if back then the EMS tournaments were the largest, but definitely now, obviously, it's the major circuit that's kind of a big deal, and there's the little lands kind of in between. So, in theory, do you kind of see the Overwatch League being just one of those like major events, and then hopefully there's little stuff in between, or?
I mean, that's the problem. Like, I do think if they do a good job of outlining when the essential off season is from Overwatch League, and if people really know like it's a full 5 months or whatever, and there's no restrictions on running tournaments, then I do feel like, bearing in mind, presumably Overwatch League would be first.
Yeah.
If there is success in Overwatch League, and then you could, obviously we don't yet know if you can actually use the teams from Overwatch League, but assuming you could, I do think that, tournament organizers would fill that real estate and they do tournaments and they try and do like what I'm saying here, have international tournaments with teams from around the world, because obviously that will always be a draw for people because of the spectacle. You don't get to see those teams play day to day. So I do feel like that would happen. It's just the problem I have is I do think it's a better compromise than what Riot's done with LCS. Like, I actually think we'll never be able to know because we never had the laboratory to run this experiment, but I actually think they just ruined their own game by doing it. I think it could have been a much, much bigger game. I think it could have been the biggest game ever if they'd have had an LCS aspect and the open circuit. I think that would have made the game insanely huge and much more thrilling for a lot of fans. So the problem I have is I think Counter-Strike, it's on the other end of the spectrum. It's very extreme.
Yeah.
But in Counter-Strike, we just have like an abundance of wealth, luxury in that sense. Like you hear people complain about oversaturation. I mean, I've obviously been someone who's quite against the concept because I feel like it's quite poorly articulated and thought out. The one thing I love about Counter-Strike is we have the majors, and at the moment we're on like a 2 major a year circuit, but we used to have 3. But beyond the majors, you could kill the majors tomorrow and Counter-Strike would still be almost as good as it is now. Like, we might have like 5 other tournaments in a year that have all the best teams there. Then you might have like 2 or 3 that have 60% of the best teams there, and then a few interesting challenges to see where they shake up. And then below all that, you have a whole universe, circuit, world of all these other tournaments that the most top teams don't ever go to.
Mhm.
But that, you know, you can win like 30,000 for first
Yeah.
place in, and have all the semi-pro teams there, and teams that are tier 2 and tier 3, or just regionalized. You know, the actual amount of tournaments in the circuit is insane. It's amazing. So it makes, if you love storylines and narratives, you can't beat that.
Yeah. So along the lines of storylines and narratives, actually, this is something that I know, or not I know, but I believe that you feel very strongly about, is the difference between online and LAN play is obviously a big difference because oh shoot, it was VP was just, wait, yeah,
Relegated from EPL.
yeah, thank you, from EPL, yeah. And this is something where currently in Overwatch, of course, the kind of scene is like held up by these online tournaments because again, we just don't have these lands. So people are like, well, we have to do something. So we're getting a lot of kind of these like basement tournaments, you know, where people are just broadcasting them from wherever they can, from their bedroom, or like Sideshow does it from like some shed in his backyard. Um, and is this something that happened early on in Counter Strike before we got these huge like majors that people kind of propped up the scene with a lot more online events than we have now?
In CS:GO,
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of online tournaments,
Mm-hmm.
but that was just because, well, I actually, first of all, it was a way to fill hours. Like,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, if there's a tournament every month or so, you still got a lot of time between that. So you used to have a lot of cups. It wouldn't just all be
Okay.
leagues, you know. Then as the game started to develop, you started to get the leagues, which ran a bit longer, you know. And for example, in Europe, you had Star Series, which eventually always culminated in a LAN finals. In America, you had ESEA, which culminated in LAN finals. Stuff like EMS would often use like a bunch of cups, so they'd have like a Sunday where it was all run, you know, and you'd tune in like kind of like a really old school approach to esports. But in general, like that's mainly more of a CS:GO thing. Like old school Counter Strike didn't really have that, just because yeah, there wasn't even as much money in the game and there wasn't as much attention, you know. So yeah, I'm obviously not a fan of online play, not least because I don't mind it as filler. Like if
Yeah.
you want to fill in the gaps between things and people have a choices to compete in it, that's fine. But I mean, I made a whole video on this topic where I outline why I think online play is different, but I'll give you a very simple example because the best ones are the extreme examples, you know, to show the contrast. So everyone knows in the early days of the online circuit of Overwatch, Envious could not lose a game, and yet they did not win a single LAN with that lineup, not a single one, and yet they were dominating everyone online. So that shows you right there, it is a different game when you come to the offline portion. So if you haven't got any offline play, yeah, we'll take online as like a
Yeah.
second best,
Mm-hmm.
but the idea like right now that's where people have to, like, I feel so bad for any pro who got to the pro level in like February of this year, because and I don't even know how you get yourself into Overwatch League at this point in time. You never got a LAN you could play it.
That's true. Because obviously if you got into it like last summer or kind of in the fall, we actually had a lot of lands and it was really fantastic, and now they've kind of disappeared. So Counter Strike, is just kind of as a series, but especially Global Offensive, is kind of a game that it's a little bit different in the fact that we actually don't have Korean domination of the like top level of the game. But of course, hasn't stopped the ever, you know, the debate that's always going to be around, which is region strength, comparative region strengths. So in Counter Strike, it's typically been European, but was there ever kind of like a very serious challenge to like the top levels from the North American teams?
Here's the thing. North
Mm-hmm.
America, it's always been exactly the same trend in all versions of Counter-Strike and all eras of Counter-Strike, which is, except for the period just after the CGS where all the top NA teams went and were in the CGS, so their version of Overwatch League, as it were, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then basically once that died, because it was in CS Source, it wasn't in 1.6, some came back, but the problem was not all of them came back, so a lot of the talent just disappeared. And then the people who were then the top teams were obviously just all the people who didn't make it into CGS.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially you just watered the talent down and then took out a lot of the best players. That's the only era when NA wasn't like able to produce a team that could have really won a major, you know.
Okay.
Every other era, there would always be at least one NA team that like could have placed top 4 or did, you know. They would always have one that was very good and got it together. And so we had in the early days, like there was a team called X3, and then a bunch of them made a team called Team 3D, and then later on we had a team called Complexity, the one that had Fraud on it, that was very, very good. And we had a team called Rival Gamerco, which was like, they were always like very competitive. So the key thing is, to me, the best of the NA scene could compete. The problem was, in terms of comparing the two scenes, no, that would be ridiculous, because the difference was, like, I remember a couple of early CPLs where, like, you know, 3 of the top 4 were just from Sweden. Forget even like Europe, just Sweden alone. So NA could have one team, but they could have 3, you know. And in CS:GO, it was fairly similar. Like, you go throughout CS:GO, and again, every now and then every year or so, you get like the one NA team that can compete. And in the early days, it was the ones like the complexity lineup with Hiko, and he had a lineup he was in before that was briefly good, Quantic. And then later, obviously, I buy Power briefly could compete. Unfortunately, it wasn't very long. Obviously, he got banned quite soon afterwards. And then you've had these Cloud9 Optic lineups later on that have been capable for brief periods of time to compete. And obviously, Team Liquid with Simple. But again, even those teams, there's some caveats to that. Like, for example, the Team Liquid and Simple made it to the final of a major. It's the furthest any NA teams made it. But that wasn't a real lineup. Like, he was a stand-in. So it's not the same as being a European team who makes it to the final of the major and then top 4 at the next event and then wins an event. So yeah, essentially you could say, without any exaggeration, Europeans were the Koreans of Counter-Strike.
Okay. And then, of course, the follow-up question is always going to be why, right? Why was Europe kind of had this as an entire region, right? Where not just at the top level, but even kind of in the midfield, they just had stronger teams as a whole. And this is a discussion I had with Stuchu, which is coaching North American players and kind of some of the ways that it's sometimes a little bit difficult. Is this also a trend and has it been in Counter-Strike where kind of maybe the middle tier North American teams just have tons of problems?
From my perspective, like, yeah, it's actually the most obvious solution to all of the NA problems, even going back into the early days of the first Counter-Strike game, would be coaching. Now, the reason why that's not something that you can just say, like, oh, well, we should have just given them coaching, is because none of those European teams who dominated had a coach or ever needed a coach. But that's the point. To me, there's a cultural difference. And I know the reason why I have this suspicion is from actually following North American sports. And ever since I started following the NBA, a little bit of the NFL, I was actually amazed how much input the coach has in actual tactics that people use, because this didn't exist in football in Europe until actually like fairly recently, when people would design like a complicated tactical system for how you defend players, for example. Aside from that, when you think of football or soccer in Europe, it's actually considered more of an art. The idea is what you do is you just look for the natural chemistry. You try and get this good player and then this good player, and they fit their roles naturally, and then you're going to hopefully... A manager in large parts in Europe in those sports is man management. He's about motivating people, keeping people like their egos in check, keeping them on the same page. And then he trusts that the players will play. He thinks if he gives a motivational speech, the players will then create the game that allows you to succeed and that they know how to play. Now, in all American sports I've seen, they essentially micromanage all the roles in the game. It doesn't matter if you're the superstar player. Yeah, they might give you leeway, but even so, there's a system you play in, and then there's players beneath you in the hierarchy who must do certain things to facilitate you. And so the key to me is, for whatever reason, I mean, perhaps America's just a more individualistic society. I feel like American players actually need to be told what their job is. Like, your job in this scenario is to do this, and from here you have these options, and this was you picked a not ideal option here, or you did well here, or this was the flaw you made. And if you coach them that way, then I think they can be just as good as the European teams. I just think that the European teams, if you go and look, naturally tend to have that type of chemistry. Now, it's different because you can't just put the blanket of Europe, because there's all these different countries, but you look at the different countries, and each of them have their own cultural twist that makes their game. It's funny, one of the things that's very interesting, this is one of the things NA probably should have studied, is that European teams, depending on what country they came from, always had a style, which I actually, from learning about those countries, can in some way tie to the cultural aspects of how their country tends to perform in sports and group activities. So, for example, famously, I mean, this is a good example because they're not big in CSGO, but the Germans used to be one of the better nations in the Counter-Strike 1.6, and every single top German team played the same group mentality as how their football team performs. Because the famous thing about the German football team is they don't have to have the star players or all the best players, but they're always very competitive internationally, because they have this approach where it's like a machine approach, like you put the pieces in like this, and you perform in a very methodical way. One thing leads to another. There's not as much freedom, for example, as in, like I was saying, like the art of playing football. Like the Brazilian teams, for example, in football, they are absolutely, it's all just inspirational. They're just playing off each other, and people are doing really creative things, and you're just hoping you're vibing with that. But that's obviously very different to how the German approach is. So you go country to country with all the biggest teams in Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and you won't just find the team styles are different, but it comes from who they are as people. Now, for NA, like I say, to me, that expresses itself more
Mm-hmm.
individualistically, no matter who you are in the team.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like the coach aspect is a way to kind of nullify the disadvantage and then bring towards some of the strengths, because that can be a strength if everyone gets taught how to play the game and does it a certain way. And I will just say, as an aside, you don't even have to make it Europe versus North America in CSGO, because South America was the best at one point in time. Only in terms of the best team. Like, they weren't really better than Europe as a region, but they had the best team for a while and arguably might have again.
Yeah, that's actually true. So this is a discussion that I have had with people as well. Is I don't know if I would prefer to have an Overwatch coach who is necessarily like who has been a previous pro player in Overwatch, or who even necessarily plays at a high level in Overwatch. There's kind of I've been thinking that maybe it's better to have someone who is coached in like League of Legends, for example, or coached in Counter-Strike, and maybe just worked with esports teams and kind of has an understanding of how to, manage players, especially, some of the younger players in North America. Do you think it's maybe better to have somebody who plays at a high level, or to have like a coach from another game who's maybe supplemented by analysts?
See, the real problem to me is just that the majority of people in every single esports game who become a coach, no matter who they are, don't have much experience of actual coaching. So if it was really, if I had like an extreme choice where I had a guy who's an expert coaching and a guy who was an expert at the game who's an expert, I would never pick the ex-pro. I mean, why would he? He doesn't know how to coach. He knows how the game works. He knows that. But that doesn't tell me he could like articulate it to a player, could convince a player otherwise, could adapt his own idea of the ideal game to fit what would be ideal for that player. Those are all coaching philosophies. Now, at the same time, it should never be a choice between the two. In an ideal world, all the coaches, I mean, in a perfect world, they'd all have some game experience. They don't have to.
Yeah.
But ideally, they'd be equipped with coaching, and some of them may be ex-pros and some of them wouldn't be, and maybe that would change how divergent their philosophy was. But to me, coaching is actually very different to knowing about the game and being an expert about the game. I mean, if that's one of the things that doesn't make any sense to me. You get players that are fantastically intelligent in the game and couldn't teach anyone how to do anything that they do. So there's a huge disconnect to me between the idea that you get a guy who is the ex-pro. So I would like them, to me, in League of Legends, it's not that the top coaches are experts about the game. To me, that's the job of like an analyst. But the top coaches hopefully can manage, can set up, the blueprint of how a team is going to run, and then figure out if a piece isn't working, whether or not he can tell that guy what he's doing wrong. He understands there's a fault there. Those are the qualities that I think you want ideally in coaches. I mean, I have to say though, if you look at the NA scene, the reason why I think they go with all the ex-pros is just because, going back to the individuality thing, NA pros throughout all esports games I have ever followed are the most resistant to coaching. That's the paradox of your scene, is that, so I'm saying in NA sports, it's all coaching and the coach has all this control over everyone. But I think that's just because if you go through any sports system in America, as you're a kid, they teach you have to have a coach. You have a little league coach, then you have a high school coach, then you're hoping you get into college, no matter who you are, and you get onto that. So there's almost like, first of all, you understand that's just the world you live in, that's your paradigm, and then you even have gratitude that you get to be coached by this NCAA championship coach. In NA, in esports, is the other way around. You're already a good player. You're not the best, otherwise you wouldn't need a coach. You're a good player, and then they say to you one day in the org, I'm going to give you this coach that you probably didn't even pick yourself, and he comes in, and the attitude, no joke, with most players is like, who the fuck's this guy? Why is he going to tell me how to play the game? And they're almost waiting for that guy to fail. And that's actually, if you notice in coaching, watch this. This principle will always hold. If there's a team where they seem a little bit resistant to coaching and they get a coach, as soon as they have failure, that's when that coach is gone. Because that's when they're like, right, see, it didn't work what he said, Well, that's not how the coaching job works, You don't have to instantly find the elixir of eternal life and fix everything, That's just a very naive way of thinking about it. So unfortunately, I feel like ex-pros that they thought were good are the only people that are in the Venn diagram that they'll listen to,
Which is definitely not ideal sometimes, because sometimes those people aren't very good at managing egos, especially, is one of the big things, like you mentioned, in North America. So moving on to another topic, this is actually something that you mentioned earlier, where going back to other versions of Counter-Strike, you would like download demos and like watch the demos yourself if you were interested. But of course now, I believe Global Offensive did as well, but Overwatch especially grew up with Twitch, and we grew up with this like amazing service where it's just so easy to just like log on and watch, maybe even just streamers, or also just watch actual tournaments. So is this something that also helped kind of Global Offensive? I can't remember the timeline exactly.
There was always streaming when Global Offensive was out.
It was 2012?
That's when CS:GO came
Yeah.
out.
Okay.
I think Twitch was out before that. Twitch was out
Yeah.
a couple of years before.
Okay.
I mean, Twitch only basically got its like hegemony in like late 2012 because it used to be a rival to Owned
Yeah.
or Owned 3D or whatever you call it, and yeah, that basically died out famously and went bankrupt. So
hmm
yeah, there was streaming, and the key thing was that's actually something that was different about CS:GO, which we didn't know at the time, but in a way maybe gave it a chance to be bigger than 1.6, which was that in 1.6, even when you had streaming, some tournaments, just because of community pressure, did still allow you to connect to the spectator client. And so a lot of us old school players never watched the stream, which obviously now, when you think about how the economics of the business work, isn't good. You know,
No.
you want everyone on the stream no matter what.
Yeah.
And then that's why we're having this observing discussion. You want everyone on the stream, and then let's hopefully fix the stream so that you don't have to say, what if I had a client to watch, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, it was important because the key thing, obviously, like I still think this is the most underrated aspect of Twitch, is that it's not that Twitch is that great a service or that great a streaming platform even. I mean, a lot of the tech's actually quite outdated. It's just that there are a lot of casual people who go to Twitch like as though it was the, you know, when you browse the menu for your TV with all the 100 channels, you know, and you skip through. But the better thing about Twitch is they have that plus like a popularity component, because you see whatever the most popular thing is in your game and you go, oh, there's a tournament on, and you click on it now. So you no longer have to know when the tournament is, go to an esports website, get the IP. There's all these restrictions that now, like, I think it's like 2 clicks to get into most big tournaments on Twitch. So obviously that barrier being removed is a massive boon to the game. So in a sense, though, you have to spin that the other way for Overwatch, and that's a bit worrying, though, because it has that advantage from day one, and it hasn't got the massive viewer base. So I don't really know how you get out of that one. That's the jam that it's in at the moment.
Or you do what Monty did in the first episode and spin it the other way and say that Overwatch has been doing great for viewing. But one of us is also much.
I wouldn't do that.
One of us is much more involved with Overwatch than. All right. So one of the things that also happened in Overwatch very early on that I took part in, and there's a ton of other people taking part in, is there was a real quick startup of people writing content as well as producing pretty high quality like video breakdowns and stuff, like what Flame's doing. Monty's done a couple. And was this something that happened up early in Global Offensive? I know there were people like War Owl, but I don't think he came in like super early in Global Offensive.
No, unfortunately, right, here's the problem. That a lot of the journalism at the end of 1.6, which at the time was, among some of the most advanced stuff out there, but obviously quite far behind what we have nowadays, was mainly done almost by like a patronage method, because what would happen is you didn't have Reddit back then, and you didn't have you would have like one site to a degree, like HLTV.org was fairly popular, but you had a lot of sites that people went to. And famously, the sites used to cross-link different news from each other. So people were used to having like a little network. Like they'd go from this site and they'd click and they'd go to the other site. And what you would have was, if you were a writer, your way of getting a living was you had to get onto one of those sites. You had to be on the tier 1 of sites, as it were. And then they had a budget because of their high viewer figures and their ad sales to be able to pay you to write. But as a result, there wasn't like a feedback loop to some degree. Like famously, when I used to work for SK Gaming and there wasn't Reddit, I could really, if I finish an article at 4 in the morning, I could just release it then, because it doesn't actually affect whether people view it or not, because they'll still go to the site the next day and see it. So there was no Reddit component like that where it's about when you do it and what you do. So when CSGO began, because the game wasn't as popular as 1.6 and a lot of the fan base didn't translate over to CSGO, early on, there was almost no content, actually. Like, one of the first podcasts that was ever done was one that I was involved in, and that's purely because a guy who was like a legend of Counter-Strike asked me and Lurpus to do it. We would have never done it ourselves otherwise. The viewership of the tournaments was very low. Interviews were very bare bones. They were like text interviews clearly done over email, or they were like very, very basic video interviews done at events. So there was like almost next to no journalism. And in fact, people wouldn't realize this, but one of the ways that journalism got started a lot more in CSGO was at the end of 2013, so only just over a year after CSGO's come out, I went and joined a site that was called On Gamers, which was a part of CBSI, and it's essentially all the content's now on GameSpot. So it was within that network of websites, and while I was working there, I had just a flat salary for the whole year, and the idea was I was just given like remit to just do whatever you want. I mean, yes, if I'd never got any hits on all my work, obviously I wouldn't continue to be hired there. But the logic was, as long as I get my hits and I'm doing good work, they could let me do anything I wanted. So actually, what I used to do was, most of my work was StarCraft 2 or it was League of Legends. But on the side, for my own enjoyment, I would do CS stuff. I would do articles, I would do written stuff, I would do interviews. If I got a chance, I would go and do interviews. So essentially, again, it was kind of surviving on just goodwill of other people. There wasn't really a market for it. So actually, in that respect, I would say that CS:GO is way behind where Overwatch is in terms of journalism, because Overwatch from day one had a lot of people, especially because I noticed a lot of people intelligently had started in League of Legends and realized, well, I didn't get huge in League of Legends, but this game's come out and I'm interested in it. So why don't I just jump immediately to that? And at least I can get some kind of like an early foot in the door.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is they all got kind of fucked because it's the only game I've ever seen get huge that doesn't have any kind of impact on the main Reddit. So that is a huge drawback, unfortunately, because listen, CS:GO's Reddit was very small when CS:GO launched. It was really small, but at least once I started to do journalism there, it had a chance to go to the top of Reddit. Now, it didn't often, but there was a chance. Whereas in Overwatch, I mean, they've essentially done their own Blizzard shutting down the scene approach with their Reddit. So I don't know what you do on that one.
Yeah,
Because I do think that limits the game, actually. I have to say, it keeps a lot of people who otherwise would gradually get into it from the casual side. They're just never going to, they're not going to one day wake up and go, don't follow the competitive scene. I'll just go to this different subreddit and start following it now. That's just unrealistic, you know.
So that was actually something that I've talked about in the past, kind of like off topic, but is that a lot of the content that I kind of suspect was people's first kind of impressions of like the competitive Overwatch scene was not the stuff done by some of the people that I think are doing really good stuff. It was done by like the Score Esports as they're like turning into like BuzzFeed Esports, because they just have like a bigger following than any particular content creator in Overwatch does right now. And because people don't really go to the competitive Overwatch subreddit, which has like a tiny fraction compared to the actual Overwatch subreddit. So I have been worried that like maybe people aren't getting the best introduction to like, you know, like very serious Overwatch content. But Reddit is another actually discussion that has been a little bit bitter for me, has been a little bit bitter for a lot of Overwatch content creators, and it's definitely, I know Harsha especially has been like really big on this. He and Monty did the the petition to the actual Overwatch subreddit. That was months ago at this point, and they basically tried to make it so that we could get esports content actually on the front page of that subreddit, because I'm trying to get rid of some of the like kind of GIF spam and crap that's going on there. So when Reddit, or for Global Offensive, when Reddit kind of was starting up, was that something that, did you ever kind of know if it was a major factor in the number of hits your work got, or was it kind of mitigated, or a smaller factor?
I mean, Reddit in the time when CS:GO came out, so 2012, Reddit used to account for like 90% of my work's hits, because back then, my Twitter following, I mean, I can't guess exactly what it is, but if I had to like think back on the progression, I might have had like 9,000 Twitter followers or something back then. So I'm not going to get any hits of that myself, because obviously not all 9,000 see the tweet. So if you think about it, at that point in time, Twitter might have only accounted for like 400 hits on an article. So it doesn't matter if all my fans follow me on there. I needed Reddit in terms of for an article to succeed. And famously, that's one of the reasons actually I got really involved in League of Legends. This is another thing people won't understand who are making this case for not having esports content helped on the main sub, is that I actually came to League of Legends solely because when I did some initial interviews as an experiment, because I mean, obviously I had a big advantage. I was a veteran interviewer, so I could do a better first interview than anyone else's, I could do interviews that people weren't doing. And then when I put them on the League subreddit, they were going to like #1. So I was going from getting like, 20,000 views on a really good StarCraft interview. It's really in depth with a player I know for a long time, to doing an interview with someone I barely have even watched, but I could do my research, etc. And it could get like 150,000 views. So as a result, I then literally started thinking, right, okay, it's not my #1 game, as in like my favorite. So I'm not going to put all my time into it, but I can now justifiably put this amount of time in, and I can plan out more content I want to do. And there's clearly something we can mine here and build up to something. And as a result, I can now create content for the community it doesn't have right now that I'm interested in doing, because I can justify it. So I think that's an area where Overwatch is sorely lacking.
Yeah. So this is something that I think I have a very biased view, because I tend to read a lot of Overwatch content, probably more than most Overwatch fans. And so I get a very strong sense of where a lot of other writers are coming from, like storyline wise. Like Volumel does a lot of really cool like storyline pieces for different players and teams. And the competitive Overwatch subreddit, they tend to do very well. But was this something in Counter-Strike where the content that was coming out really helped shape some of the storylines for teams going into different events, or was it kind of neglected?
Well, I mean, it did, but here's the problem. It was me and Lurpus, that's it. We were the only ones. So if anyone else did articles, a lot of them were like, their problem is, this is actually a classic problem as well. This is also why you need a subreddit that attracts and justifies the work of professionals,
Mm-hmm.
because you do get writing talents that come up, and there are occasional people who turn out to be fantastic. But even then, when they first start out, because they haven't learned the technical skills, like that thing with the coaching, where you have to learn to be a coach even if you're an expert.
Yeah.
You have to learn the technical skills of writing and creating content and how to craft things, and that's a skill set in itself. So the problem is, a lot of the early people in CS:GO who only started with CS:GO, they didn't have the skills. So even if they had like an okay idea, they couldn't execute it, so it would be crap and it wouldn't have much influence. But at the time, me and Lurpus obviously came from 1.6, and we were influential because we had big names. He was obviously an ex-pro, and I was obviously like one of the better-known journalists. And so it's no exaggeration. It was a solid maybe 2 years before you start to get other people involved. And actually, if you follow CS:GO at the moment, it only really blossomed like it has now in terms of like written content and a lot of people making videos in like the last 9 months to a year, because a lot of the people, I mean, this is one of the reasons I've played an active role myself in trying to promote the people that came up that I thought had potential and that were good, because otherwise a lot of them didn't know how you break in the scene, and didn't know kind of what you have to do to give yourself a chance. So in the early days, I mean, in this sense, I can absolutely blow my own horn, because people like Lurpus and myself, the storylines that we focused on the most and the ones that we returned to and built into a narrative, people don't realize it. But okay, at the time, say we made a narrative about the fact that, okay, NIP's winning tournaments, but they're starting to show some signs that they're falling apart, Fiflaren, famously, their fifth player that he ended up retiring. He was the one who underperformed the most and started to show signs that if you ever were going to replace someone, he'd be the obvious person. When we weave these narratives in, yes, there were tons of vocal fans who were like, "You're an idiot, you don't know anything, that's not the case, it's all lies." But here's the thing, go back in time now, see fans talking about that era, and you would think that they were just copying and pasting our articles. That's all everyone remembers, because it sticks in their minds so well. And obviously, hopefully to the extent that we did a good job of outlining a narrative that was there. We didn't just invent it, And so I know, until the days when you got a lot of other people involved, even before I was doing a lot of the events, just from a lot of my journalism work, this did craft a lot of the narratives. Like, people will forget this, but yeah, Kenny S was amazing at the end of 2014 and in early 2015. He was like very, very good in the game, but I never shut the fuck up about it. So as a result, people know that he was like at the highest peak ever, and because I kept talking about it all the time. And so what they don't realize is their memory is my memory. I did a better job of articulating my memory, so it became the virus that infected their minds.
That's terrifying. Oh my god.
Good. It's happened in a lot of games.
Unfortunately, it's a little bit scary that we can have that much kind of influence. And that actually is something where, going back to Volumel, the one that Volumel I remember like very distinctly was he wrote the article for Meta Athena where he was talking about the Royal Road. And it was a really good article. He gave a ton of examples in other titles as well about Royal Roads. And then after that, I think it was Monty and Doa started using it on air, and then like Yahoo Esports, like even like Gamers where I wrote, people started using that phrase Royal Road, and it's not like he invented the phrase, right? But just the work was like so good, and it really made sense to everybody that across the board people started using it, even at much bigger sites, people who are much more well known than he is. So there is some power there. So the question that I've been asking everybody about each game is, what is something that you liked about what Counter-Strike did early on? Maybe besides the open circuit, because we've had that discussion before, that Overwatch isn't doing, that you kind of want to see happen. I've had people give me like balance stuff, like Stuchu talked about Dota, like how they balance it. He kind of liked that. Trying to think what else. What are some of the other answers? Monty actually did also talk about open circuit. So is there something else maybe?
Here's the problem. I'm literally going to have to scrape the barrel to give you. I can give you something, but
okay.
I'll have to set in place the context of this. I thought CS:GO was an absolutely appalling game. I still don't think it's that much better. It is better, but put it this way, it's not like it's better and we're like, well, it's fine now. Well, no, keep working on it. You have a lot more work to do before it's acceptable.
The UMP is amazing.
So there's a lot of so the game itself, like, I can't give any credit to Valve for anything they did in the first year or so. They did nothing. In fact, they literally did nothing. And then in terms of game balance, I think they did a terrible job. They fucked around with a lot of stuff that actually hurt competitive play, like how you sprayed and stuff like that. And they even did a lot of things that I thought were quite negative, like when they made. So here's the thing I'm going to say is a positive is something that doesn't exist now, but I'll say it because I actually think if Blizzard was to listen, or you could just do it outside of Blizzard, this is something that every esports game should have, as long as it uses maps, which is that What we did was
Okay.
in CS:GO. So the game launched in terms of competitive play, as in the first tournaments. We're in like August of 2012. So the first major wasn't until November of 2013. So we had over a year before the major system began and before Valve literally could dictate what happened in competitive play. And what we got was in I think it was in early 2013 this was introduced. The initial release maps for the retail version of Counter-Strike, a lot of them were not good, and even worse, had elements in them that actively like ruined the map. And so what happened was we had a whole bunch of people, some of them like pro players, some of them just map makers, who tweaked the maps, and they made these versions called special edition. It would be _SE or _CE. And what they would be was they were just the same map but tweaked a little bit to make it work better competitively. And what this actually did was around like the summer of 2013 especially, it meant that we had this awesome map pool where even maps that famously were quite imbalanced, like obviously a map like Train was a good example, the special edition version was way better. Now the problem, and at the time, they had this scenario where Valve was going to come in with the major system, and they basically said the logic that you hear every game dev say, and they say it as though it was an axiom, even though I've never seen it proven anywhere, which is that the fan must finish the exact same version of the game that he is playing. I've never seen any data to back this up whatsoever. And so they said, you can't have these, custom versions of the map. You've got to just go back to the retail versions.
Okay.
And so we actually went back to the retail versions. And by the way, as a side note, just to really stick it to Valve, the final map of the major, which decided the first major, was an old retail version of Train that people hadn't played in quite a while, and that was actually worse. And as a result, there was an upset champion of the tournament, whereas actually the special edition version, NIP, who was one of the top teams, they were the best in the world on that map, and that was the deciding map that they lost in the first ever major final. So I would say if you could do it, I think that's a great point. Let the competitive community have some say in the maps and how they're done, because I think you just get a better pool of maps. I mean, famously, just before the major system came in, someone who was on one of the top teams as a staff working for them did a poll, like an Excel sheet of all the teams, and something like 18 out of the top 20 teams at the time all voted that they wanted to use the special edition version of the map. Now, that didn't matter. Valve didn't listen. They got rid of all the maps, and we have never had special edition maps since. We have always been at the mercy of Valve as to whether the maps are good.
So, I'm trying to think, because I know that now Valve, of course, will take a map like out of the pool, right, and make changes to it and stuff. And
yeah, but that's only they who change it, though. So you have to hope that they fix it themselves.
that's true. But a lot of the time when they make those changes, they do stuff like change little angles or something, or they like add a few pixels. Is that kind of what you meant by like some of these special edition maps?
Yeah, it wasn't. The whole point is they didn't overhaul the whole map. They would just take like one area and they would say, right, at the moment, this doesn't work. Like this choke, for example, is just impossible for anyone to get through. So we've got to add in a little thing here, or we've got to move something back. Famously, one of the things they did was on Train, I believe the key change they made was they moved the bomb site, I think, outside, like actually where you plant. On the map was the same, but where you planted, they moved. Because famously, in the retail version, they'd done this very bizarre thing where like, it was like really out in the open, and what's bizarre was terrorists could always plant, like they could nearly always get there, but they used to lose the majority of rounds. It just made no sense. It was very counterintuitive, the idea that you could always get the bomb down, but because it's out in the open, as soon as you've planted it, you're out in the open, and everyone just kills you and they defuse the bomb. So little tweaks like that, where through people realized what was wrong, and that someone, by the way, someone could not have known that before the game came out. Like, you can't hypothetically know how someone will play the map. But that's my point. That to me, there has to be a feedback loop between how it's played and how you tweak the map. You can't just throw it out there and then just say, let's just have that work forever.
Okay, I see what you mean then. And I think that is something that I know there are a lot of pro players who are very vocal about certain maps, and small changes like that, that would be a big deal. So the ultimate question that the whole point of this series, and we'll end on, is do you kind of think that Overwatch is doing well for being 1 year old?
In the context of its peers, it's doing well, because you have to realize every other game when it was 1 year old was probably doing worse than it is. I mean, not right now because they've killed the LAN circuit, so that's terrible. But if you think about like 6 months ago, the heyday of Overwatch at the time, you know, when everything was building up, it had LAN circuits, it had Apex going on, it had a bunch of involved. At that point in time, I think it was actually way ahead of the track for where it should be as an esports game. Like League of Legends took many years to become a big game. Counter-Strike, like I said, actually, the problem with Counter-Strike is it didn't have organic growth. What it had was terrible growth that was totally stagnated, and then Valve figured out this epiphany to have skins and then bring in the major system, and those things combined out of nowhere just made it grow. That was like that's like it got like steroid injections or something, you know. So in terms of actual organic growth, I think Overwatch was doing pretty well, especially for the first year. Now, you can't judge it entirely on that because obviously all these games are taking place different periods of time. So time itself was different. The culture was different. The industry was different. But I think it's doing fine. Overwatch's problem is it just isn't doing fine relative to Overwatch as a game and what it could be. That's the problem. The whole point is it could have had, if the game was more appealing or the observing was better or the tournament circuit was better or Blizzard figured out some of these aspects, and it could have had, like, you know, 5 times more viewers, or it could have had way bigger tournaments that like seemed like majors even before Overwatch League, you know. Because I actually feel like another aspect where Blizzard didn't, in my opinion, didn't think through the esports side is if I personally was making an esports game, I would have just started out with less modes. I wouldn't have an esports game where I don't just have to learn how the maps work, who these teams are, what they're doing. I have to learn all these different modes and then the meta for how each mode is played. Like, that's so incredibly complicated, you know. If you try to appeal to a casual pleb fan, League of Legends has 1 map and 5 roles. You know, like, it's not. It has a lot of problems as a game itself, but it's not that complicated to understand the basics, you know. It's incredibly complicated to understand Overwatch.
That's very true, actually, and hopefully that's something that we can get fixed in the future. But in classic Thorin style, we'll just end the video there.